Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Andre Porter and I'm the Science Policy Analyst at the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. Today's webinar is entitled Procuring, Administering, and Negotiating Corporate Funding for Research. This webinar today is sponsored by ASBMB's Public Affairs Advisory Committee, which is made up of 18 ASBMB members from around the U.S. dedicated to advocacy and science policy. Today we have two wonderful speakers here today, and today we have Cherise Kent and Dr. Philip Thomas. Dr. Kent is the Director of Corporate Engagement at Rutgers University. She has more than 20 years of experience in structuring and negotiating research commercialization agreements across a variety of institutions. She also has experience in technology transfer and business development and has been responsible for annual giving, corporate foundation relations, major gifts, and cultivation programs for two organizations on the University of Pennsylvania campus. Dr. Cherise also has an MBA from Drexel University. We also have Philip Thomas, who is an independent researcher at UT Southwestern, focusing on understanding aberrant protein folding and regulation of protein expression as a basis of the disease, in particular cystic fibrosis. Dr. Thomas consults and advises both private foundations and commercial drug discovery efforts. He is a co-founder of Reata Pharmaceuticals and Recode Therapeutics. He trained in chemical engineering at Columbia University, biochemistry at the University of South Dakota, and molecular and structural biology at Johns Hopkins University. This is some housekeeping. If you've joined by phone, please mute your line so we can avoid any background information or background noise, excuse me. Also, as a heads up, Dr. will give a presentation for around 10 to 15 minutes, then we'll open up for both Cherise and provide feedback. So if you have any input that either in the chat box or the Q&A box. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Ken.
Okay, thank you. This is Cherise Kent. First of all, I want to thank the coordinators for inviting me to present, and I want to thank everybody who's joining today online. So I've prepared a presentation that is largely driven by my own personal experience, first working in the pharmaceutical industry and doing externalization, licensing, and mergers and acquisition. But then very early in my career, I worked on the Penn campus in a variety of research commercialization roles. So I've structured this presentation to hopefully capture what my approach is to partnering with industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're structured here at Rutgers. I'm going to go through some of the differences between working with industry as opposed to the process that's usually most familiar with academic PIs, which is filing, making grant submissions, and then conducting research under funded projects. And then I'm going to provide hopefully some tips and some tools, and then I'm going to walk through a couple of case studies of two partnerships and how those partnerships have evolved. So thanks again for allowing me this opportunity. So first of all, I just wanted to talk about Rutgers. I don't know if everybody is familiar with Rutgers, but one of the reasons we have invested in a broader centralized corporate engagement group is because the geography of Rutgers is very complicated. We have locations up in Newark, which is primarily where our biosciences is located. I would say that the hub in New Brunswick is a combination of biosciences and life sciences, engineering, and humanities. And in Camden, we have what I would refer to as it's a smaller institution, much more like a, I'm going to call it like a 4-year private college, but there's also a presence of our graduate business school and our law school. So it's very big. We generate quite a bit of money in research expenditures. We pull in a lot of money from sponsored programs and research grants. And we have a very, very active technology transfer office. And as someone in corporate engagement, I work very closely with a lot of the offices that are focused on technology licensing, actually negotiating sponsored research, and then I have to work with the people in our sponsored programs and our accounting groups to make sure that we receive monies from companies and those monies are spent in a way that is aligned with the contract. So again, here's some statistics about just how large Rutgers is: 69,000 students, 29 schools and colleges, 150 undergrad majors. But I think what's really interesting here is the number of alumni that we work with. And this is one of the approaches that our office takes, is that sometimes our best champions for industry sponsorship are those alumni. And one of the things I always talk to our PIs about is understanding where your graduate students are going, where undergrads are going, because they can be great connections for you if you're interested in partnering with industry. Because in many respects, they're usually very positive about being a champion for their former institution. So I want to just talk a little bit about corporate outreach models, because I think one of the most important things that you need to really understand is you should really try to find and seek out the folks at your institutions that are focused on corporate relations, industry relations, or corporate engagement. They will reside in usually one of two areas. They're either in your foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of your organization, or they could be in the VPR office, where they sit among licensing, contracts, and economic development. But most of these folks are very focused on engaging with industry. They have built up contacts over the years that they are probably very willing to support with you, and those contacts could be industry contacts or alumni contacts. And I think that in most cases they're going to be very experienced in talking with industry and helping you through the process of establishing a partnership. And sometimes those partnerships take a while to cultivate. Sometimes those partnerships might evolve from what appears to be a very innocent appearance on a panel somewhere, inviting someone from industry in to be on a panel, or having some mixers with some of your graduate students. But it's worth the time and effort to cultivate these partnerships, and I think if you seek out your corporate relations colleagues, they can be very, very helpful to you. So what's evolved at Rutgers is the corporate relations people previously sat in two separate offices. There were some in the foundation, there were some in the VPR office, and what we have now at Rutgers is we have a centralized corporate engagement center. And part of the reason why we've centralized that activity is because it was a little confusing to our PIs when they were attempting to reach out to the corporate relations team. They weren't sure which professionals that they should work with, so it was a little confusing internally. But it also makes it a lot easier for companies, because the way that we're structured is almost along the lines of external relationship, client relationship development, so that we work with very specific companies and we try to really understand what their particular needs are at any given point in time. I'm probably most focused on, and I'm probably judged from a performance perspective of bringing in funded research projects and increasing those numbers of dollars that come in from industry. But there are a number of areas that we work across, including student recruitment and engagement, licensing and commercialization of technology. I mentioned the research collaborations, but we also work very closely with some of our partners on joint federal proposals. Again, there are some of our partners who have been long-standing partners for a long period of time. or in any given calendar year or across a few calendar years, maybe they've done a lot of work in one particular school and they may choose to come in and do some philanthropy. We also service specialized college and research centers, connecting some of our faculty who put on conferences to our industry contacts and collaborators. And what we're also seeing is a real increase in companies coming to campus and wanting to either tailor programs in executive education or tailor programs in what they're calling upskilling for some of their employees. So we touch all of these different areas, and we work with companies to make sure that we help them meet their needs. So when we think about the partnering landscape at Rutgers, I think it's helpful from a faculty perspective. If you think about our activities falling into kind of two buckets when we're cultivating companies. First of all, companies might choose to innovate research projects because they might not have the talent internally to advance the project. They might not have the bandwidth or the time to advance the project. So they're looking for key partners externally, or they might be interested in accessing some unique techniques or models or approaches that you have in your lab. In other words, they can't do it all on their own, and they recognize that. So they look to academic partners to maybe fill gaps. But the other thing that's really important is they're all looking for talent, and this comes back to my previous point about knowing where your graduate students are, knowing where undergraduate students are, because they can really help make connections for you in industry, especially if they've gone on. And what we find here at Rutgers is that the companies who hire our graduates are very pleased with the talent that they're getting, and that's almost like a calling card for us. So they're willing to come to campus, talk to us about innovation and also talent acquisition. So we're typically working with leaders at firms that are focused on these two things. In other words, they're competing for the same talent, and from time to time they have to approve any kind of externalized research. So I always keep in the back of my mind that there are two things that appeal to companies. It's helping connect them with innovative faculty to solve certain problems, but then also introducing them to really good talent that they might choose to come to campus and recruit. And so what we do is, based on this approach, what we really try to do is we try to build different types of engagement with companies that run the gamut of companies not really having to come on campus and spend any money, like talent recruitment, student mentoring, workshops, seminars, team-taught classes, and we always try to get industry folks on our advisory boards. That's also a really great way to connect with industry, and it doesn't cost them anything. And then as you build the relationships with these, what I refer to as low-risk engagements, because it's not costing them anything, then you kind of move into areas of sponsored PI research, funded student research, research commercialization and licensing, sometimes collaboration and venturing, strategic initiatives. They may be interested in advancing a certain area of research on campus that's strategic to them. It might be strategic to the state, and it might be strategic to the school. And then again, what we also try to do is get them involved in philanthropy. So this is something that we like to share with our PIs because it was developed by a scientist at Hewlett-Packard, the Partnership Continuum. And I think it really captures our approach to partnering, which is companies really want a broad-based relationship with the university. I think that they're more inclined to identify some key academic partners and then really build out the relationship across the university because it's probably efficient and a little bit more effective. So I always try to encourage the people that we're working with, if they are successfully engaging with a company, they might suggest to that company there might be other ways for the company to engage on campus, because the broader that engagement is, the more likely that you're going to be able to bring the companies back and do more, because it's just a very effective and efficient way for companies to operate. And this was developed by a scientist at Hewlett-Packard. So I don't know. It's something that I just like to put in front of folks as a conversation tool. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences if you are in a position where you are cultivating an industry partner and you're moving through that conversation of trying to understand if there are synergies with respect to them coming on campus and doing a funded project. I try to identify the differences between an industry project and a funded research project by the government. There are some key differences that I think it's always important to keep in front of you. So most important that the products are typically tied to strategies or objectives. So they're trying to solve a problem related to developing a product, or they're trying to access a novel tool or approach that they don't have. So in most cases, when they're willing to externalize a project, it is on their critical path. And once you begin discussing with them and once you discuss synergies, and it seems like both parties really find that it's going to be mutually beneficial to move forward, you're going to have a very, very high likelihood of success. But I think that what you have to do is you have to remember a few things. So first of all, just remember the process, and what I try to just break it down into 4 areas for RPIs. So typically, those early stages, you go back and forth and you develop a proposal. And then once that proposal is agreed, what we usually do here is I work with school-based contacts to build out a scope of work and also a budget so that we make sure that all the work that the PI has proposed is well funded. And then once we have the SOW and the budget, we move toward contract negotiation, and we have a separate group in corporate contracts that negotiate those agreements. So one of the things I think that's critical to understand if you are engaging with a company, always ask them up front what they think the duration of the project is, because that will give you some sense of how much they're usually willing to invest. Sometimes it's going to be a 3-month duration, sometimes it's going to be a 6-month duration, sometimes it's going to be longer, but that will give you some idea of how much they're willing to invest. Then really kind of understand their timelines, because again, it's usually tied to something on their critical path, and they're going to want deliverables according to that timeline. So you have to make sure that you're resourced in your laboratory to meet those timelines. And then most of their cycles are based on their fiscal year. So if they start talking to you at like maybe July or August in one calendar year, they might not be funded for the work that particular year, so you might not see that contract be executed until the following year. So that's always a good conversation to have with a company. What the duration is, what the timelines are, and when the project will be funded. And I think that there are certain terms and conditions that I always like to talk to a company about very early on. I like to understand confidentiality. I like to talk about deliverables, what types of deliverables they're looking for, again, according to what timelines. If there's reporting that they want, I usually like to make sure that the PI understands the types of reports. Is it just phone calls? Is it written reports, interim reports? Then very important for the faculty and the company, because not all companies are used to working with academic institutions. So I like to really walk the companies through how intellectual property rights work under an academic contract. And then I always try to make sure our faculty understands that there's usually a no publicity clause, or you should, if you enter into a contract with a company, there's usually a clause that says publicity only upon written consent. So I think it's important for you to understand that, and if you do want to put a logo on a flyer or on your web page, you really have to talk to the company and get their approval to do that. And then the other thing I like to help PIs is in the area of project management. I always encourage them to do a kickoff meeting once the contract is signed, because the proposal might have been discussed maybe 3 or 6 months ago. So it's very, very good to establish a kickoff meeting to get people refocused on the project. And then also make sure that you understand what kind of communications plan you have with the company. And again, that relates to reporting. So I just wanted to go over again the very, very high level process. There's usually an exploration period that that involves trying to understand if there are any kind of synergies exist. Then you usually go through the proposal, scope of work development, and budget. Then once those are decided, you move to a contract negotiation, and it's usually a separate office in your institution that manages that contract negotiation. Then once the contract is assigned, I like to make sure that the accounts are set up so that there's an efficient transfer of funds, and if there are any kind of triggers that that might relate to a payment, I want to make sure that the PIs understand that, and that that's also set up on the accounting side. And so then the good news is you get to do your research and you work toward your final deliverable. But what I wanted to just stress here is that your corporate engagement professionals or staff can help guide you through this entire process and help you with all of the actions related to these different phases. I wanted to just see if there's anything that I missed. Always make sure that when you're talking about your final deliverable, you talk to the partner about in what form they would like the deliverable. I think that that's very important, and sometimes our faculty forget that. But you know, timelines are important, setting up accounts are important. So all of these matters can be supported by your corporate relations staff and professionals. So I guess at a very, very high level, my tips would be if you are engaging with a company, ask them and listen to what it is they really want. I always suggest that our PIs ask for a problem statement because that can really help to kick off a conversation. And then recognize again that the corporate culture is a little bit different. They're very focused on confidentiality because they are developing products that compete in the marketplace. Sometimes they go silent because they do report back up to their management. They have quarterly objectives, and they may actually time some reports and communications that are tied to their internal quarterly objectives. Then again, annual budgets, they typically will either have the money in a given budget year to support a project, or you might need to wait to go through the next fiscal year before they have the money for the project. And then, of course, try to keep in mind the deliverable deadlines. Again, I talked about project management. Really try to focus on a kickoff meeting. Think about how to communicate back and forth with the companies by pulling together project meetings or project calls. Make sure that if the company wants reports, the reports are the timelines for the reports are developed and known. And then sometimes if you've got multiple projects in your lab, you may need to develop some firewalls. You don't want work to overlap in your laboratory if you've got multiple partners. So that's something that you should really talk to your corporate relations people about, because there are ways that you can construct those firewalls, and that also relates to confidentiality. So you have to really be careful about what you might be talking about in lab meetings if you've got two people doing projects that have been funded by separate companies. So to avoid triage and troubles, I would say, you know, follow these tips, leverage the experience you have at your university, but first and foremost, consider yourself a member of their team. If you are engaged in a funded project, consider yourself part of their team. Make sure that the communications are open, and just be as open and communicative as you can. And this is one of the tools on the right-hand side here that we work with. I try to work with all of our PIs to develop profiles that capture their research interests, their research expertise, the value proposition of their research. It's very easy for me if I'm talking to a company. If I have these on hand, I can just shoot them to the company, and it's just a great way to start a conversation. So cultivation tools, again, with companies, I would say leverage industry need for talent, keep in touch with your grads, talk with your advancement offices, and to really try to involve your alumni. Again, keep one-page profiles and your website up to date, and make sure that you really focus on defining what and any kind of unique tools, techniques that you've developed, and also notable papers. Proactively engage, especially at your conferences. There are usually people from pharmaceutical companies walking around that are insights professionals. Really engage with them, get their information, and follow up with them. And then if you're really looking to find companies where there's high alignment between you and your research, what you might want to do is do patent searches, and then really pay attention to people that are sitting on certain types of conference panels. Work within your region across what we refer to as ally organizations. We work very closely with BioNJ and the New Jersey Technology Council. It's a great way to meet industry, so you can participate in events and be on panels. Again, leverage existing communications within the university and school and really try to understand who's coming to campus. And again, always try to be discreet when you're promoting the work that you're doing with industry. Remember that there's typically that no publicity clause. So I always try to encourage my PIs to just refer to a partner as a worldwide pharmaceutical company or a worldwide cosmetic company. Here's one of the things that we do here over on the right. We invite some of our alumni to come in and speak to graduate students along with our faculty. It's a nice way for industry to come on campus. It's a great way for them to connect with faculty, but it's also a great way for them to connect with graduate students. And to kind of close out, what we find is that typically the things that really drive broad engagements, here are two companies that we work with, a worldwide technology company. You could see all the work that we're doing with them. It runs the spectrum from talent engagement to strategic initiatives in the area of advanced manufacturing. And then on the right side, we have a personal care company that we have a master agreement with, and we've done 60-plus sponsored agreements. They're just moving into some other areas. But we find that these relationships are really alumni-driven. They're driven by an interest in accessing student talent and faculty talent. All of the problems they're trying to solve if they're externalizing a project are pretty much on their critical path. And sometimes we find that it's more likely that we're going to be partnering with companies within our geography because it makes it easy for them to come to campus. But we also know that if a company is trying to solve a problem and the best faculty member to solve that problem is in Nebraska, they will go to Nebraska and they will seek out that faculty member. It's just a matter of making that connection. So that's my presentation. I hope that it was useful for you. And again, I wanted to thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Sharif. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them shortly. So next up, I want to have Phil discuss some of his experiences in corporate engagement.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My presentation, by my own nature, will be a little less formal than the one we just had. I thought I'd touch a bit more on my personal experiences. But first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be involved in this. And secondly, I would like to say if anyone has any specific questions offline, feel free to drop me an email at philip.thomas@utsouthwestern.edu, or if something comes up after the presentation. So I thought I would just start by giving you a bit of my background and how I got into these relationships with the commercial side of things in addition to running my academic lab. About 30 years ago, I got interested in cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease, and as many of you probably know, 30 years ago, it was there was really nothing that treated the root cause of the disease, and that's changed here in the last 8 or 9 years, and patients are reaping the benefits of medicines that were developed, based on fundamental basic research, largely done at universities. So I started my academic lab 26 years ago, and we were working on very kind of fundamental things about cystic fibrosis and other protein folding diseases. And through the CF Foundation, I became involved in initiatives they were undertaking to use the commercial side, in other words, biotech in particular, to try and get people interested in developing methods for cystic fibrosis. So I sat on a number of advisory groups for the CF Foundation while they evaluated different commercial proposals, and they decided what they might want to fund to get them to a certain point and see if that was worth further support. So that was my first taste, and I must say I'm an older person, and I came from the era when we kind of looked down on the commercial side from the academic side, and I would say I've had a sea change over the last couple of decades in that, and so this leads to why you would want to do this. So I would say if you're egocentric, one reason to do it is because you learn a different way of doing science, and that can actually reach in to your academic labs and change and improve the way you do things, the way you ask questions. So in a self-serving way, that's one reason to do it. But I would say, on the other hand, why would you do this? I would say because if you have ideas or fundamental results, the way to really test them is to see if they can be translated into products, into useful products, right? So that's a real test of things. So now, I've given you a reason for why to do it, so I thought I'd switch here briefly to how. How would you do the transfer? And I can give some examples from my own side of things. I mentioned that I was advising the CF Foundation, and just based on that, I saw gaps in knowledge, gaps in needs, and things, and that got me involved on the entrepreneurial side of trying to start some commercial concerns on my own, including Reata Pharmaceuticals, which was started nearly 2 decades ago, I think 18 years ago, and more recently Recode Therapeutics. And that's been a transformative process for me as well. But let's talk about how an academic lab might interact with industry, and both of those 2 examples I gave you fall under the first category, and that's knowledge or intellectual property. So if you have intellectual property such as a composition of matter patent, or you have found a compound that you believe has a useful activity, the first thing you'd do is you would contact your tech transfer office at the university, and because honestly, at least at the University of Texas, none of these things belong to the faculty member. They all belong to the Board of Regents. So your duty is to report things that you've found and make sure that they're protected in a way that they have value to the university, but also they have value to the commercial concerns, because if property isn't properly protected, no commercial concern will touch it, because they're afraid someone else can just come in and, they won't develop it with that kind of risk. So let's say you come up with an assay or a way of doing something. You should report that to your university. You might, in our university, they call it an intellectual property questionnaire you fill out. You send that, and then they have, they'll contact patent attorneys. They'll do some searching and see if there's a need for that technology, and then they will decide whether they want to protect that property. So that would be one way that you could first interact with a company is that the university itself may go out and advertise that patent portfolio after it's filed, and they may look for outfits to license that, right? So if there is a particular concern that would like to license such a technology, they're likely going to want access to the inventors, right? And I think every university is different, but there's about how those licenses are prepared, but that's, I would say, I have a slightly different personal experience from Charisse, and that's I don't know how you can go out and pitch yourself so well to a big pharma or a biotech. In my case, it's been much more passive, where I have either technology or expertise that they need access to drive their program forward, and they actually seek you out. So the other way that this could happen, if they want your expertise, is they could do something called a sponsored research agreement, and that this is a way they just make a contract basically with you, and this would carry overhead for the university, much like a grant, and there's going to be reporting requirements, and it could be to do a specific set of work. Now, these types of works will be defined very clearly. For instance, they may say, I want you to test our compound, and we're going to send you 3 compounds. One's a dud, 2 are active, and we're not going to tell you which one's which, so it's blinded, and we want you to do experiments X, Y, and Z, and make a report and send it to us, and the contract actually also will stipulate that you are not to do any other experiments on this. So this is important, not only legally, not to put yourself or your university in jeopardy, but also because I would say there's a degree of trust that goes into these things. So, you know, for instance, a large pharmaceutical company doesn't want to send a compound out that they're afraid someone will stick in an NMR tube and figure out what the structure is. So there is a degree of trust in this beyond what just the simple legal documents protect. Now, the other way that money can come into the lab would be through a contract, and that may be that they want a specific material. Let's say you express a specific protein that they need, and they could write a contract for you to deliver so much of that material at such a purity. So what I would say there is someone asked a question about budget. So this is where you have to be really careful and keep things separate, is because you cannot use, for instance, American Heart money or NIH money or money from the CF Foundation to support work where you're producing a material that you're going to then sell, basically, to a commercial concern. So you also have to be very careful that you don't try and go cheap on the budget, because as we all know, not every experiment works, right? So you don't want to put yourself in a position where you've taken a payment and you've promised to deliver something, and then for whatever reason that experiment goes wrong and you have to do it again. So, and you don't have the funds and the budget to do that. So my advice to people would be to be conservative with your budget. In other words, conservative in the sense that make sure that you can deliver what's promised on the budget that's requested. In other words, give yourself some wiggle room there. Okay, one other thing I did want to touch on here is why would a company come to you? So it really has to be that you have a unique ability to perform a certain set of experiments, or a unique knowledge set, or as I mentioned, you have an intellectual property that you've developed and has been protected by the university. But in the end, it comes down that it's just too costly for them. So you may be able to do something that they feel like is on the critical path, and maybe eventually they could do it themselves, but it's just more economically sound to go through you. So try and remember that. Sharice touched on publishing, and so I'm just going to give you, this is not anything I learned from a PowerPoint provided by the university or anything, but I think you have to be very careful in protecting your students as well. So as we all know, students need to make progress towards their dissertation, postdocs as well. They need to publish if they expect to get the kinds of jobs many of them want. So based on the restrictions on publishing that Sharice mentioned, you have to be very careful to use students or postdoctoral trainees to do this work because they need payment as far as part of a publication. So that can work out many times because many times there'll be restrictions on publication that don't preclude publication. What they do is you have the right to publish the work, but you have to give the company, say, 30 days or 90 days to look at the publication and approve it and perhaps file for any intellectual property protection they might have that arose out of the work, etc. So you really have to keep your legal and your tech transfer people in the loop on this, and my advice is to go to them early. Okay. The other thing that was mentioned at one time is a conflict of interest. So there are instances where you may, let's say you own stock in a company, or it was a company that you co-founded and you have some equity position in the company. You need to manage those conflicts of interest that you have. And at our university, we have a whole conflict management committee and management plans, and these things are overseen. So just be aware, you know, a guiding principle is don't do anything that you'll be embarrassed if you see it in the newspaper, right? So that's one bit of advice. I would like to talk, just as I come towards the end here, is about paperwork. My experience has been that you talk with maybe a specific scientist or two within the organization, the commercial organization, and you'll come up with what experiments you want to do and what experiments they don't want you to do, and you'll come up with a statement of work, as Sharice mentioned. But at the end, you just write maybe a brief report. So my experience is there's actually a lot less paperwork burden on the faculty member than there are for grants, because it's a much more terse kind of presentation in doing the statement of work as opposed to a grant proposal, and the reports tend to be concise as well. So at our institution, this is kind of reflected, I think, in the overhead. So if you do a sponsored research agreement at the University of Texas, the overhead on that is about, I would say, around a little over half of what it would be, for instance, for an NIH grant. So let me see. I think I've pretty much covered what I wanted to cover. I could give you some more specific examples as time goes on, but in the interest of time, I think I'll open it up for questions, if that's okay.
Great. Thank you, Phil, and thank you again to Sharice. So again, I want to reiterate that if you have a question, please submit it either in the chat box or the Q&A. We'll shoot them to our speakers as they come in. So the first question that I have is for either one of you. It's in regards to soliciting a company or trying to get funding from a company. Do you find that there are companies that have a request for proposals similar to what the federal government does, or are all the connections that you make have through personal connections with individuals at the organization, or reaching out, or the company reaching out to you?
This is Sharice. We have experience with that here. It's both. For example, Google recently sent us a request for proposals for They were interested in early career faculty that were doing research in a very specific area. It was broad, but it was specific. And then J&J, they have requests for proposals that they send out from time to time. They're typically announced on their website. They have a very broad program for sponsoring women STEM leaders, so you might want to take a look at that. But your corporate relations office should be tracking all of the requests for proposals that come out of companies. So again, it's good to get to know those people in those offices. Now, one of the ways that we work is that we work very closely with companies who will just pick up the phone and say, you know what, we're in the final phases of formulating one of our skincare products, and we've noticed in some of our testing that it's creating an issue for certain people. Can you pull together a group of faculty that we can discuss this issue with and try to, resolve this formulation? So they will come to us with very specific problems, and then we push those, we call them search requests, to our faculty to see if there are faculty that are interested in talking to the companies about working on a very specific project. So it's actually both. And then there are some instances where I might be working with a faculty member that I know has a very interesting tool or a very interesting approach to solving a problem, and I will very proactively create a profile for that faculty member, and I will push it out to companies that I talk to regularly to see if there's any interest in having the faculty member come and do a lunch and learn or do a video chat or a tech talk. So we do all of those three things here at Rutgers.
Are there any databases that you know of?
We actually have a database that's called Research with New Jersey that contains profiles of research faculty in the state of New Jersey from all the research institutions. However, I find that those databases are not always current because they're pulling information from various sites that are not always kept current. So I always find the best way to engage with companies is talk to them at meetings, work through your corporate engagement groups, invite companies to your university to sit on panels. So I take more of a business development approach because that's the profession that I come out of, and I think you're much more likely to, I think, connect with a potential partner if you rely less on databases. I think databases are good for maybe doing an initial search, like doing a patent search or doing a lit search, or there are some databases out there that are very focused, and usually the tech offices have them, that track the status of drug candidates, which are in discovery, which are in phase 1, which are in phase 2. So there are databases out there that can maybe get you lists of companies, but I always find it's best to connect with them proactively, either via phone or at conferences.
Great. So the next question I have is one about how you differentiate between fixed service fee work for industry versus a sponsored project.
Yeah, this is Phil. The contracts that I've been involved in are usually to deliver a reagent or a material, and so those would be fixed. And the sponsored research agreements tend to be to do some specific experiments that are of indeterminate outcome, or a family of experiments that are of indeterminate outcome, or if you really develop trust and the commercial concern really feels like they need your expertise, it can almost be like a retainer. In other words, they give you something per year, and then you're kind of on retainer to do specific experiments as requested, right? Again, when you do that, you always have to be cogent of the fact that the university, and these will be defined by the contracts that are written on these sponsored research agreements, that the university has rights to the product of your intellectual pursuits, right?
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that with respect to the fixed costs. When you're developing your budgets, they should always be driven by the amount of time you think you need to dedicate to the project. So there's a line item for all of your salaries and your supplies, and then maybe instrumentation that you might need to purchase. But usually what we do is we tend to advise our faculty members not to give a really detailed budget, but maybe break it down very, very simply. And then, let's say the project, once you add the F&A, comes out to $100,000. We usually make it a fixed cost because it's just so much easier from an accounting perspective. So then what we usually ask for is an upfront. Sometimes we ask for an interim if the project's really long. And then we ask for another payment upon completion and acceptance of the deliverable. So fixed rates are really the way we go here. It's a lot easier. And I think the companies tend to also like the simplicity of making the payment up front and then making the final payment.
Great. I think that speaks partly to the question that we received about how project costs are estimated given if you already have the equipment. So is there any other thing you want to add to that, how you estimate costs when you're negotiating the price?
One thing that I tried to indicate in my presentation is that, so I agree, you estimate what the salaries are, you estimate what the materials, the supplies you're going to use, the time on the equipment with, you can base that based on some time of depreciation. If the equipment depreciates to 0 in 5 years and it costs X dollars and you're going to be using it for 3 months, you can just do the arithmetic. But I also try and work in there failure rate because, you're committing yourself to doing something and you have a deliverable. So you have to assume, like, when we do, for instance, that prep, every third one is not up to the QC criteria that are set forth in the contract. So you have to work that into your budget and leave room to accommodate for failures.
I think that's all very good advice.
Great. So there's a question that you answered in the chat, Phil, about using research assistants and long-term postdocs for corporate-funded research. Do you see a difference in how those projects are received by the corporation or by the institution? Because there are costs that are associated with having graduate students and trainees as opposed to having a full-time research assistant.
I'd like to take a stab at this because what I'm finding is that because these companies are all fighting for the same talent, many companies come to campus and they really want to work with graduate students or postdocs, and they will tell me that. So then it's really up to the PI to really decide whether or not the graduate student or the postdoc has the bandwidth. So that to me is a decision that needs to be discussed with the PI and the potential corporate sponsor. But what we are seeing a lot of now is that faculty are becoming a little bit more, not every graduate student or postdoc is going to get an academic appointment. So there has to be some alternative exposure while they're in the lab to other potential career paths. And one of the ways that you can do that is by bringing companies on campus and structuring funded work that leverages the talent of graduate students. And our graduate students really appreciate it, but it's not for every lab. There are only, there are some PIs that it's not part of the culture of their lab, but there are other PIs that are very open to it, and they want to bring companies in and work with the companies and their graduate students. So that to me is a PI decision.
this is Bill. I'd just like to continue on that because I am a lab that's open to these people going into the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera. I have a number of my former trainees that are in the pharmaceutical or small biotech industry. But I think you actually have to engage the student themselves in these kinds of questions because it's the old golden rule thing. You don't want to do something to somebody that they don't know about that you wouldn't want done to yourself. So I do agree with Cherise. If a student says, listen, I might want to go to an industry job and I'd like to do that project just so I see what it's like somewhat, I think, the student can have some input on that. On the other hand, if a student says, I have no interest in going into industry, I'm all about getting my papers in order so I can get an academic job, then it becomes a slightly different equation. Then you have to go in, is this just kind of routine work that only goes to support the efforts of the company, or is something likely to be generated novel that's a publishable unit, and would that publication occur in a time frame that can benefit the student? Then you just engage the student and just make sure that they're aware of everything that's going on. So I think communication is key, and I would encourage people not to make decisions for students without including students and trainees in those conversations.
Okay, great. So we're almost up to the hour, so I have at least one or two more questions left. So the next thing I want to ask is about restrictions on scientists and trainees. So do you guys see a difference in obtaining corporate funding or support if the researcher is not a U.S. citizen or is living abroad, or their trainees are not U.S. citizens?
Bill, did you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I don't really see any reason why there would be any distinction depending on where you're born, but so maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, the only thing we have to check on is like if it's a defense contractor, right, like a Lockheed Martin or a Boeing or a Raytheon or something, they may be precluded from doing work in an academic lab if part of the work relates to a U.S. government project that they're working on. But one of the things that I do is we recently did a graduate competition over in our engineering school. A technology firm came on campus and wanted to fund 2 graduate fellows. So the applications were open to any graduate student that wanted to propose a solution to a very specific problem statement. But one of the things I had to do is I had to go back to the advisors and ask them if they were international students, because then I really had to talk to our global international group, because there are certain restrictions on some international students with respect to how much time they can dedicate, and sometimes they also pay additional fees. So I wanted to make sure that the money that was coming in to support them for a year was, and the work that they would be expected to do could be done under the contract award. So those are the only 2 times where, I pay special attention to international students.
Great. We're almost at the hour, so I don't want to hold anybody else's time up. I want to take the time to thank you again, Cherise and Phil, for joining us for this webinar. I think it was extremely helpful. You guys gave a very intense overview of how to obtain funding from corporate sponsors, and thank you for participating in ASBMB's webinar. And I also want to thank everybody for showing up. We will be posting this webinar on ASBMB's YouTube page as well as on asbmb.org under advocacy and webinars.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Oh, week.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The chairperson has disconnected. The conference will now end.